The dust hung thick as a shroud in the stale air of the Redemption Saloon, each motor tiny, dancing witness to the ugliness unfurling beneath the flickering gas lamps. It clung to the sweat-slicked brows of the men packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces a gallery of grim anticipation, lust, and the casual cruelty that thrived in such desolate corners of the territory. On a crudely erected platform, fashioned from appended whiskey barrels and warped planks, stood a man named Silas Blackwood, his voice a greasy rasp that coated every word with false bonhomie. He was a vulture in a waistcoat, eyes like chipped obsidian glinting with a merchant's avarice. Beside him, small and trembling, stood the reason for this gathering, a girl no older than 12 summers, her thin dress, the color of dishwater, hanging loose on her bird-like frame. Her name, though no one here cared to know it, was Ilara. Her hair, the hue of sun-bleached straw, was matted and tangled, framing a face pale with a terror so profound it had stolen her voice, leaving her eyes, wide and the color of a stormy sky, to scream silently into the suffocating silence of the room. A rope, coarse and biting, was tied loosely about one of her wrists, the other end held negligently by Blackwood, a leash for a creature he deemed less than human. The air thrummed with a sickening energy, the collective weight of depraved intent pressing down on her. Men shifted, muttering low, their gazes stripping her bare, assessing her like livestock. Blackwood raised a hand, the gesture expansive, theatrical. "Gentlemen, gentlemen! Feast your eyes!" A rare flower, plucked from the wilderness, untouched, unbroken, yet his chuckle was a wet, rasping sound. Guaranteed healthy, strong enough for work, and, trainable, he gave the rope a little tug, and Ilara flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but one that sent a ripple of cruel amusement through the crowd. A few coins clinked as a bidder, emboldened by cheap whiskey, raised a hand. $10 for the girl, a voice thick with phlegm called out from the shadows. Blackwood's smile widened, revealing teeth stained yellow. $10. A paltry sum for such a prime specimen. Do I hear 15? The heat in the saloon intensified, or perhaps it was the shame, so potent it felt like a physical force, though none here would admit to it. Ilara's gaze drifted, unfocused, past the leering faces, past the grime-streaked windows, to a place beyond the suffocating walls, a place that existed only in the desperate recesses of her mind. She saw a field of wildflowers, a memory so faint it might have been a dream, the sun warm on her skin, a melody her mother used to hum. Then, the vision shattered as a new bid, louder, more aggressive, cut through the haze. 20. The bidding climbed, each offer a fresh nail hammered into the coffin of her childhood. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The floorboards vibrated with the stomp of boots, the scrape of chairs. Blackwood was in his element, his voice rising in a crescendo of greed. 30. Going once, going twice, just as his hammer, a tarnished gavel, was about to fall, the saloon doors, already scarred and battered, didn't just open, they imploded. Wood splintered, hinges screamed, and the heavy doors slammed inward with the force of a cannonball, striking the wall with a deafening crash that silenced every voice, froze every movement. Framed in the sudden, stark opening, silhouetted against the dying orange light of the prairie sunset, stood a figure. Tall, lean, clad in dust-caked denim and worn leather, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in deep shadow. The only glint of light came from the twin Colt peacemakers holstered low on his hips, their wooden grip smooth and dark from use. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, a monolith of quiet menace. The air, already thick, now crackled with a different kind of tension, raw and dangerous. Even the motes of dust seemed to still their dance. Silas Blackwood, mid-sentence, his gavel raised, stared, his mouth agape, the greasy confidence draining from his face like water from a sieve. The men in the crowd, moments before a jeering mob, now shrank back, their bravado vanishing. The silence that descended was absolute, heavier than any sound, broken only by the ragged, shallow breaths of Ilara, who had opened her eyes to witness this sudden, violent interruption. The newcomer took one slow step into the room, then another, the jingle of his spurs a funereal rhythm against the sudden stillness. His boots, caked with the mud of 100 nameless trails, made no sound on the sawdust-strewn floor. He moved with a predator's grace, an economy of motion that spoke of countless confrontations, of a life lived on the jagged edge of violence. As he advanced, the shadows shifted, and a sliver of fading light caught his face. It was a landscape of harsh lines and old sorrows, eyes the color of gunmetal, cold and watchful, set deep beneath a heavy brow. A scar, a pale slash, ran from his left temple to the corner of his tightly set jaw, a permanent testament to past pain. His name was Caleb, though few knew it, and even fewer dared to speak it in his presence. He stopped a few feet from the makeshift stage, his gaze unwavering, fixed not on Blackwood, but on the small, trembling figure of Ilara. For a long moment, their eyes met, hers wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, fragile spark of something akin to hope, his unreadable, yet holding an intensity that seemed to absorb all the light, all the ugliness of the room. Blackwood finally found his voice, though it was a mere shadow of its former bluster, thin and reedy. Who in damnation are you? This is a private transaction, friend. No concern of yours. Caleb's gaze shifted, slowly, deliberately, to Blackwood. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, gravelly, like stones grinding together, each word carrying an immense weight. She's not for sale. It wasn't a request, not a negotiation. It was a statement of fact, immutable as the mountains. Blackwood bristled, a flicker of his old arrogance returning, fueled by the presence of his paying customers. Now, see here. I have a bill of sale, legal and binding. This merchandise is mine to dispose of as I see fit. He gestured vaguely towards a stained document on a nearby table. Caleb's hand, resting near the butt of his pistol, didn't move, yet the threat was palpable. That paper means nothing, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men, those further from the door, began to shift, their hands inching towards their own weapons. Caleb seemed to sense it without looking, his awareness encompassing the entire room. Anyone else feel like bidding? He asked, his voice still quiet, yet it cut through the saloon like a razor. No one spoke. No one moved. The silence stretched, taut and humming. Blackwood, seeing his authority and his profit evaporating, tried a different tack, his voice laced with a false bravado. I mean to start trouble, mister? There's a lot of us, and only one of you. Caleb's lips thinned, a humorless line. Numbers don't always mean much. He took another step, bringing him almost to the edge of the platform. His eyes flicked back to Ilara, a brief, almost imperceptible softening, then hardened again as he looked at Blackwood. Let the girl go. Blackwood licked his dry lips. And if I don't? For the first time, a shadow of something akin to weariness crossed Caleb's face, quickly replaced by grim resolve. Then this town will be short one auctioneer. The finality in his tone was chilling. He reached into his vest, not for a gun, but for a small, worn leather pouch. He tossed it onto the platform. It landed with a heavy thud, the clink of coins audible even over the frantic beating of Ilara's heart. That's more than she's worth to you alive, Caleb stated, his voice flat. Take it. And walk away from her. Blackwood stared at the pouch, then at Caleb, then at the suddenly very still and watchful crowd. Greed warred with fear on his face. The money was tempting, more than he'd likely get now. He stooped, snatched the pouch, and fumbled with the drawstrings, his eyes confirming the weight of gold and silver within. He looked up, a sliver of cunning in his gaze. And what's to stop me from coming after her again, once you're gone? Caleb's expression didn't change, but his eyes seemed to grow colder, darker. My memory, he said softly. And the certainty that if you do, I'll find you. He paused, letting the words sink in. No matter where you crawl. He then reached out a hand, slowly, palm up, towards Ilara. Come on, child. Ilara stared at the outstretched hand, scarred and calloused, yet somehow offering a promise of safety in a world that had shown her none. She looked from the hand to Caleb's shadowed face, then back at Blackwood, who was now backing away, clutching the pouch, his eyes darting nervously. With a shuddering breath, she took a hesitant step, then another, her small, bare feet moving across the rough planks. She reached out a trembling hand and placed it in his. His grip was firm, surprisingly gentle. He didn't pull, just waited for her to gather herself, then turned, drawing her with him, away from the stage, away from the stench of greed and despair. The crowd parted before them like water before a ship's prow, their faces a mixture of fear, resentment, and a grudging, bewildered respect. No one spoke. No one dared to intervene. Caleb didn't look back as he led Ilara out of the shattered doorway, into the fading light of the dying day, leaving behind a silence in the Redemption Saloon far heavier than the one his arrival had first imposed. The wind, sharp and carrying the scent of distant rain and sagebrush, whipped Ilara's thin dress around her legs as they stepped out of the suffocating confines of the saloon. It was a cold comfort, but a comfort nonetheless, washing away the lingering stench of stale beer, sweat, and fear. Caleb kept her hand in his long strides measured to match her smaller, faltering steps. He led her towards a lean, dust-colored gelding tethered to a hitching rail further down the dilapidated street, its reins looped loosely. The town of Redemption was aptly named, Ilara thought, not for salvation, but for the grim transactions it facilitated, the souls bartered and sold within its dusty limits. Eyes watched them from shadowed doorways and behind grimy windowpanes, hostile, curious, fearful. The townsfolk, complicit in their silence, now bore witness to its consequence. Caleb seemed oblivious to their stares, his focus solely on the task at hand, getting away. He untied the gelding, which snorted softly, nuzzling his shoulder. He swung up into the worn saddle with an easy, fluid motion, then reached down for Ilara. "Up," he said, his voice still low, but without the hard edge it had held in the saloon. She hesitated, her small hands gripping the fabric of her dress. The horse was tall, its dark eye regarding her with an unnerving placidity. Caleb waited, his patience a tangible thing in the twilight. Gathering a courage she didn't know she possessed, born of a desperate desire to leave this place behind, she reached up. His grip was strong as he easily lifted her, settling her in front of him on the saddle. Her back pressed against his chest, and she could feel the steady beat of his heart, a rhythm surprisingly calm given the recent confrontation. He wrapped one arm loosely around her waist to steady her, his touch impersonal yet secure. With a soft click of his tongue, he urged the gelding forward, not at a gallop, but at a steady, ground-eating pace, away from the main street and towards the open prairie that stretched, vast and indifferent, under the darkening sky. The last vestiges of the sunset painted the clouds in bruised purples and fiery oranges, a dramatic, somber backdrop to their departure. Ilara risked a glance back. Redemption was already receding, a collection of ramshackle buildings sinking into the encroaching shadows, its faint lights flickering like malevolent eyes. She felt a shiver, not entirely from the cold. Caleb must have felt it, for he adjusted the worn saddle blanket slightly, trying to offer her more cover, a gesture so small yet so unexpected it brought a fresh prickle of tears to her eyes. She blinked them back fiercely. She had shed enough tears in that saloon to last a lifetime. They rode in silence, the only sounds the rhythmic hoofbeats of the gelding, the creak of leather, and the mournful sigh of the wind. The prairie night descended, vast and star-dusted, beautiful in its desolation. Caleb seemed to navigate by instinct, picking a path through the uneven terrain, avoiding patches of thorny scrub and hidden gullies. He offered no words of comfort, no explanations, and Ilara asked for none. The terror that had gripped her in the saloon had subsided, replaced by a profound weariness and a fragile, uncertain flicker of something else, a sense of protection she hadn't felt since before. She didn't know this man, this silent gunslinger who had appeared out of nowhere and shattered her nightmare. She didn't know his name, where he came from, or why he had intervened. But for now, his presence was a shield against the darkness, both literal and figurative. Hours passed. The moon, a pale sliver, rose high, casting long, dancing shadows. Ilara, exhausted beyond measure, began to nod, her head lolling against Caleb's chest. He shifted slightly, making her more comfortable, his arm a steady anchor. She finally succumbed to sleep, a troubled, restless slumber filled with fractured images of leering faces and the sound of Blackwood's grating voice, but now, somehow, overlaid with the steady rhythm of a horse's gait and the faint, reassuring scent of dust, leather, and something uniquely Caleb. He rode on, his eyes scanning the darkness, ever watchful. The child in his arms was a featherweight, yet her presence was a heavy burden, a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't refuse. He thought of the gold he'd left behind, a significant portion of what little he possessed. It was a cheap price, he knew, for a life, for a soul. He'd seen too many souls lost, too many lives bartered away in places like Redemption. His own past was a landscape of such losses, a desolate terrain he rarely allowed himself to revisit. But the girl's fear, so raw, so palpable, had cut through his weariness, through the callous built up over years of hardship and violence. It had reminded him of other faces, other desperate eyes. He looked down at her sleeping form, her face peaceful in the moonlight, the tear tracks dried on her cheeks. A protective instinct, fierce and unfamiliar, stirred within him. He was no hero, no savior. He was just a man who knew the look of true evil and, for once, had been in a position to stop it. What he would do with her now, he didn't know. He was a drifter, a man with no home, no ties. But he couldn't leave her. Not yet. Not until she was safe, truly safe. And where that place was, he had no idea. The wind grew colder, carrying the promise of a storm. He pulled his worn coat tighter around them both, a silent vow passing between him and the uncaring wilderness. He would keep her safe. For as long as he could. The trail ahead was dark and uncertain, much like the future. But for now, they moved through the night together, two solitary figures against the vast, indifferent canvas of the West, a gunslinger and the child he had pulled from the abyss. The first light of dawn was a smear of bruised grey on the eastern horizon when Caleb finally drew the gelding to a halt. They were in a shallow ravine, sheltered from the worst of the wind by a crumbling escarpment of red rock. Sparse, twisted junipers clung to the slopes, their roots exposed like gnarled fingers. He had chosen the spot carefully, offering concealment and a meager source of firewood. Elara stirred as the horse stopped, blinking awake, disoriented. The cold morning air bit at her exposed skin. She looked around, her eyes still clouded with sleep and fear, taking in the desolate landscape. Caleb dismounted, his movements stiff from the long night in the saddle. He gently lifted her down, her legs unsteady beneath her. "Stay here," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He didn't wait for a reply, but took a canteen and a small, canvas-wrapped bundle from his saddlebags and moved a short distance away, beginning the tasks of making a small, smokeless fire. Elara watched him, her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. He moved with an efficiency that spoke of long habit, gathering dry twigs and fallen branches, arranging them with practiced care. Soon, a tiny flame flickered to life, a small beacon of warmth in the chill dawn. He put a battered tin coffeepot on to boil over the flames, then unwrapped the bundle, revealing hardtack biscuits and a piece of dried jerky. It wasn't much, but to Elara, whose stomach had been a knot of fear and emptiness for days, it smelled like a feast. Caleb didn't speak, didn't look at her directly, but he placed a biscuit and a strip of jerky on a flat rock near where she stood. A silent offering. She hesitated, her ingrained fear warring with a gnawing hunger. His back was to her as he tended the coffee, his presence still imposing, yet there was nothing overtly threatening in his posture. Slowly, she crept forward and took the food, retreating a few steps to eat. The biscuit was hard, the jerky tough, but it was sustenance. She ate slowly, deliberately, her eyes never leaving him. He poured coffee into a single tin cup, drank some, then refilled it and gestured towards it, leaving it on the same rock where he'd placed the food. She approached again, cautiously, and picked up the cup. The coffee was black, bitter, and hot. It warmed her from the inside, chasing away some of the chill. They existed in this silent tableau for a while, the only sounds the crackle of the small fire, the sigh of the wind through the junipers, and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Elara finished her meager meal, feeling a little more human. The immediate terror had receded, leaving a hollow ache of loss and uncertainty. This man, Caleb, was an enigma. His actions in the saloon had been swift, decisive, brutal in their implications. Yet now, he was quiet, almost gentle in his aloofness. He hadn't hurt her, hadn't demanded anything of her. He had simply removed her from one hell and brought her into, what? She didn't know. He finally spoke, his gaze on the horizon, where the sun was beginning to paint the sky in bolder strokes of orange and pink. We need to keep moving. They might send someone. Elara flinched at the thought of Blackwood or his men. The brief respite from fear vanished. Caleb saw her reaction, a subtle tightening around her eyes. I don't think Blackwood himself will come, he said, his voice still low. He's a coward. But he might pay someone else. Or word might spread. He paused. There are always men willing to track for a price. He rose, kicked dirt over the dying embers of the fire, and began to repack his meager supplies. His movements were economical, efficient. Elara stood, uncertain what to do. Can you ride for another day? He asked, glancing at her briefly. She nodded mutely. She didn't know if she could, but she knew she had to. There was no alternative. He seemed to accept her silent affirmation. He saddled the gelding, checked the cinch, then turned to her. This time, when he offered his hand to help her up, she took it with less hesitation. As they rode out of the ravine, the sun was higher, casting long shadows. The land stretched before them, vast and empty, a daunting expanse of rock and scrub. Caleb set a southerly course, away from any established trails, deeper into the wilderness. He seemed to know this land, or perhaps he was simply skilled at navigating its harsh contours. Elara found herself observing him more closely. The lines etched on his face told stories of hardship, of sun and wind and sorrow. His hands, when she glimpsed them on the reins, were scarred and calloused, but his touch when he'd helped her mount had been surprisingly gentle. He carried himself with a weary sort of preparedness, as if he expected trouble around every bend, yet met it with a stoic resignation. He was a man of contradictions, a violent man who had shown her kindness, a silent man whose actions spoke volumes. The silence between them stretched, but it was different now. It was less a silence of fear on her part, and more one of watchful waiting, of unspoken questions. She wondered about the scar on his face, about the sadness she sometimes saw in his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. She wondered why he had risked himself for her, a stranger. But she didn't dare ask. Words felt too large, too intrusive for the fragile space they occupied. For now, survival was the only language they shared. And in that harsh, unspoken vernacular, they were beginning, slowly, to understand each other. He offered her water from his canteen periodically, pointed out a distant herd of pronghorn antelope, a fleeting moment of shared observation in the vast emptiness. Small things, almost insignificant, yet they were threads, weaving a tenuous connection in the desolate tapestry of their journey. The sun climbed high, beating down mercilessly. Dusk coated them, gritty and uncomfortable. But Caleb pressed on, his focus unwavering, and Elara, drawing strength from his quiet determination, endured. She was no longer just a victim, she was a survivor, riding away from her past, towards an unknown future, with a dangerous, silent man as her unlikely protector. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the gnawing ache of hunger eased by meager rations, and the ever-present watchfulness of Caleb. He pushed them hard, keeping to broken country, avoiding trails and settlements. He was a ghost in the wilderness, and Elara, by his side, was learning to be a shadow. They found temporary shelter where they could, shallow caves that offered respite from the biting night winds, groves of cottonwoods by scarce, muddy creeks, the lee side of rocky outcrops. Each stop was brief, just long enough for a few hours of restless sleep, a mouthful of food, and then they were moving again. Caleb was a parsimonious user of words, but his actions were a constant lesson in survival. Elara watched him build small, almost invisible fires, how he read the land for signs of water or danger, the way he cared for his horse, treating the animal with a quiet respect that bordered on affection. She learned to recognize the subtle shift in his posture that indicated alertness, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he scanned the horizon. She saw him clean his guns with meticulous care each evening, the ritual a somber reminder of the violence that was an intrinsic part of his existence, and by extension, now hers. He began to include her, in small ways, in their daily routines. He'd gesture for her to gather firewood, showing her by example which deadfall was best. He showed her how to find certain edible roots, though their taste was often bitter and unpalatable. Once, he pointed to a set of tracks in the dust, coyote, he'd grunted, then deer. He was teaching her the language of the wild, a harsh and unforgiving dialect, but one necessary for survival. She remained mostly silent, the trauma of the saloon still a heavy cloak around her. But the silence was changing. It was less born of terror now, and more of observation, of a slow, hesitant unfurling. The constant presence of Caleb, his unwavering, if distant, protection, was like a steady poultice on a raw wound. He asked nothing of her, made no demands, simply provided a shield against the world that had sought to consume her. One evening, as they huddled around a tiny fire, the wind howling like a hungry wolf outside their shallow rock shelter, Caleb was mending a tear in his thilbag with a needle and coarse thread. Ilara watched his large, calloused hands manipulate the small needle with surprising dexterity. He seemed far away, his thoughts lost in the flickering flames. Suddenly, a small field mouse, emboldened by their stillness, darted from a crack in the rocks, scurried close to Ilara's worn boot, and began to nibble at a fallen crumb of hardtack. Instead of recoiling, Ilara watched it, a flicker of something soft in her eyes. She remained perfectly still, allowing the tiny creature its meal. Caleb noticed. He saw the way her gaze softened, the slight, almost imperceptible easing of tension in her shoulders. It was the first spark of something other than fear or weariness he had seen in her. He said nothing, just continued his mending, but he filed the observation away. Later that night, as Ilara slept fitfully, wrapped in his spare blanket, Caleb sat watch, the peacemaker resting loosely in his lap. He looked at her small form, the rise and fall of her breathing. He was a man accustomed to solitude, to the harsh comforts of his own company. This was different. He felt a responsibility that went beyond mere duty. He saw glimpses of a resilience in her, a stubborn spark that refused to be extinguished despite all she had endured. He found himself wondering about her past, about the mother she must have had, the life she'd known before Blackwood. Such thoughts were dangerous, leading to attachments, to vulnerabilities he couldn't afford. Yet, they came unbidden. He still didn't know what the future held for them. He had no plan beyond putting distance between her and her tormentors. But the thought of abandoning her, of leaving her to fend for herself in this brutal world, was becoming increasingly untenable. He was bound to her now, by an act of impulsive intervention that had become something more profound, something akin to a sacred, unspoken trust. The loneliness of his existence was still a familiar cloak, but it felt different now, shared, in a strange way, with this silent child. He was her protector, yes, but perhaps, in some small, unacknowledged way, she was becoming his purpose. The next morning, as Caleb was preparing to break camp, Ilara, who had been watching him, pointed to a small, hardy wildflower pushing its way through a crack in the dry earth, its petals a surprisingly vibrant splash of purple against the dun-colored rock. She didn't speak, just pointed, her eyes questioning. Caleb looked at the flower, then at her. He grunted, a sound that could have meant anything, but then he said, his voice rough, "Desert bloom." Tough. He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, pretty. Ilara's gaze met his for a fleeting second, and for the first time, he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. It was a tiny, ephemeral thing, gone as quickly as it appeared, but it was there. A small, fragile flower blooming in the wasteland of her sorrow. It was a beginning. The uneasy rhythm of their journey, a constant oscillation between watchful movement and wary rest, had lulled them into a semblance of routine, if not peace. Caleb, always vigilant, had chosen a narrow, winding canyon for their passage, its high walls offering some protection from the relentless sun and prying eyes. He'd felt a growing unease for the past day, a subtle prickling at the back of his neck that years of living on the edge had taught him to heed. He scanned the ridgelines more frequently, his hand rarely straying far from the butt of his Colt. Ilara, attuned to his moods, sensed the shift, her own small shoulders tensing in unconscious imitation. She'd begun to find her voice, not in conversation, but in small, hesitant utterances. A soft cold when the night air bit too deeply, a quiet water when her throat was parched. Each word was a victory, a tiny flag planted on the desolate landscape of her trauma. Caleb acknowledged them with a nod, a grunt, or a simple, direct answer, his own laconic nature a strange comfort to her. It was late afternoon, the shadows beginning to lengthen and play tricks on the eye, when the feeling of being watched intensified. Caleb reined in the gelding abruptly, his head cocked, listening. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the rocks and the distant call of a raven. "What is it?" Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible. Caleb didn't answer immediately. His eyes, narrowed and sharp, swept the canyon rim above them. Then he saw it, a flicker of movement, quickly gone, a glint of reflected sunlight where no sun should glint. "Trouble," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion, yet carrying a chilling certainty. "Hold tight," he urged the gelding forward, no longer at a steady pace, but into a bone-jarring trot, seeking a defensible position. The canyon twisted, and around a sharp bend, he spotted a jumble of fallen boulders, creating a natural barricade. "Behind there," he commanded, swinging down from the saddle and pulling Ilara with him. He pushed her gently but firmly towards the rocks. "Stay down." "No matter what you hear," he tethered the gelding in a small alcove, partially hidden, then took his Winchester rifle from its scabbard. He checked the load, his movements economical and precise. Ilara huddled behind the largest boulder, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fragile sense of safety she had begun to cultivate shattered like glass. The fear was back, cold and sickening. But this time, it was different. Mixed with the terror was a desperate concern for Caleb. He was her shield, her only protector. If something happened to him. The thought was unbearable. From above, a voice echoed down, rough and mocking. "Well, well. Look what we have here, boys." The brave gunslinger and his little pet Ilara squeezed her eyes shut. She recognized the inflection, the cruel amusement. It wasn't Blackwood, but it was one of his kind, a man who thrived on the suffering of others. Caleb didn't reply. He was pressed against the rocks, his rifle aimed upwards, scanning the rim. Another voice, coarser, joined in. "Heard you cost Mr. Blackwood a pretty penny, friend. He ain't too happy about that. Sent us to collect his property. And a little extra for your trouble." The click of a rifle bolt being drawn back was unnervingly loud in the suddenly still air. "Come on out, hero," the first voice taunted. "Make it easy on yourself. Just give us the girl." Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew they were trying to draw him out, to get a clear shot. He remained still, patient, his breathing slow and even. Ilara peeked through a small crevice between the rocks. She could see Caleb, a silhouette of grim determination. She wanted to scream at him to run, to hide, but she knew he wouldn't. He would stand his ground. For her. A shot rang out, the bullet ricocheting off the rocks near Caleb's head with a vicious whine, sending stone chips flying. He didn't flinch. "Last chance," the voice from above yelled, an edge of impatience creeping in. Caleb finally spoke, his voice calm, carrying clearly in the confines of the canyon. "You want her, you come and get her." It was a challenge, stark and unequivocal. A string of curses rained down from above, followed by a volley of shots. Bullets thudded into the rocks around them, spitting dust and stone. Caleb returned fire, not wildly, but with carefully aimed shots, forcing the men on the rim to take cover. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of gunfire. Ilara pressed herself flatter against the cold stone, her hands over her ears, tears streaming down her face. This was a nightmare, more terrifying than the saloon, because this time, the violence was immediate, explosive, and aimed directly at the one person who had shown her kindness. She saw Caleb wince, his left arm jerking, and a dark stain began to spread on his sleeve. He was hit. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her fear. He gritted his teeth, shifted his rifle to his right hand, and continued firing, his movement slightly hampered but no less deadly. He was buying time, but Ilara knew, with a terrible certainty, that he couldn't hold them off forever. They were exposed, outnumbered. She had to do something. But what? She was small, weak, terrified. Then her eyes fell on the gelding, tethered nearby. It was restless, spooked by the gunfire, pulling at its reins. An idea, desperate and half-formed, sparked in her mind. It was foolish, dangerous, but it was something. While Caleb provided covering fire, drawing the attacker's attention, Ilara scrambled on her hands and knees towards the horse. Bullets whined overhead. She kept her head down, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Reaching the gelding, she fumbled with the knot of the reins, her small, trembling fingers clumsy. If she could spook it, send it running down the canyon, it might create a diversion, draw their fire, give Caleb a chance. It was a wild gamble. Finally, the knot came loose. She slapped the horse hard on its rump, yelling, "Go! Go!" The startled gelding reared, then bolted, thundering down the narrow canyon, its hooves striking sparks from the rocks. For a moment, the firing from above faltered, surprised by the sudden appearance of the riderless horse. "What the hell?" one of the men yelled. "He's trying to escape!" Several shots followed the fleeing horse. Caleb seized the momentary distraction. He rose slightly, aimed carefully, and fired 2 quick shots. A cry of pain echoed from the rim, followed by the sound of a body falling. "Jed!" "They got Jed," another voice screamed, panicked. The tide had turned, however slightly. Caleb pressed his advantage, his shots becoming more accurate, more deadly, despite the pain in his arm. Ilara, watching from her hiding place, felt a surge of adrenaline. Her small act had made a difference. It wasn't much, but it was something. She had not just been a passive victim. She had fought back, in her own way. The remaining attackers, their confidence shaken, their numbers reduced, seemed to hesitate. Their fire became sporadic, less accurate. Caleb knew this was his chance. "Stay down," he yelled to Ilara, then, using the rocks as cover, he began to move, flanking their position, his injured arm making his progress slow and agonizing. The fight was far from over, but the immediate, overwhelming threat had been blunted, thanks to a terrified girl and a desperate gamble. The past had caught up with them, violent and brutal, but it had found them not entirely unprepared, not entirely defenseless. The canyon air, thick with the acrid bite of gunpowder and the metallic tang of blood, slowly settled as the echoes of the last gunshot faded into the indifferent stone. Caleb leaned heavily against a blood-smeared boulder, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. His left arm throbbed, a searing fire that radiated from his shoulder down to his fingertips. The dark stain on his sleeve had spread, soaking through the coarse fabric of his shirt. He'd managed to drive off the remaining attackers. One lay still on the canyon rim, a dark silhouette against the fading light, the other had fled, his panicked shout swallowed by the wilderness. But the victory was costly. He scanned the desolate landscape, his eyes searching for any sign of further threat, but the canyon was silent now, save for the mournful whisper of the wind. Ilara, her small face streaked with dust and tears, crept out from behind her rocky refuge. She saw Caleb, saw the blood, the pallor beneath his sun-darkened skin, and a cry, small and choked, escaped her lips. She rushed to his side, her earlier fear momentarily eclipsed by a desperate, urgent need to help. "You're hurt," she whispered, her voice trembling. Caleb grunted, trying to push himself upright, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he sagged back against the rock. "Just a scratch," he muttered, though the pain in his eyes betrayed the lie. Ilara looked at the wound, at the torn flesh and the steady seep of blood. It was far more than a scratch. Her mind raced. She remembered her mother tending to her father's injuries after accidents on their small, hardscrabble farm. She remembered the clean rags, the boiled water, the careful tending. Here, there was nothing but dust, rock, and the growing shadows. But she couldn't just stand there. She looked around frantically, her eyes landing on Caleb's canteen and the remnants of his saddlebag, which lay discarded near the gelding's previous tether. With a newfound resolve, she scurried to the saddlebag, rummaging through its meager contents. She found a relatively clean strip of cloth, perhaps once part of a shirt, and his whetstone. Not much, but it was something. She grabbed the canteen, her small hand struggling with its weight, and returned to Caleb. "We need to clean it," she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Caleb looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his pain-filled eyes. This was not the silent, terrified child he had rescued from the saloon. This was someone else, someone with a nascent strength he hadn't fully recognized. He nodded, a curt, almost imperceptible movement. Ilara uncapped the canteen and poured a little water onto the cloth, then gently, hesitantly, began to dab at the blood around the wound. Caleb winced, his jaw tightening, but he didn't pull away. The bullet had gone clean through the fleshy part of his upper arm, a miracle in itself. But it was bleeding freely, and the risk of infection in this unforgiving wilderness was high. As she worked, her touch surprisingly deft for her age, Caleb watched her. He saw the concentration on her face, the furrow in her brow, the way her small hands, though trembling, moved with purpose. He had saved her, yes, but now, in a way, she was saving him. The realization was a strange, unsettling thing. He was a man used to relying on no one but himself. Vulnerability was a weakness he had long ago learned to suppress. Yet here he was, wounded, dependent on the care of a child. Tighter, he rasped, as she tried to fashion a makeshift bandage from the strip of cloth. Need to stop the bleeding, she nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line of determination, and pulled the cloth tighter, knotting it as best she could. It was a crude dressing, but it would have to do for now. The bleeding seemed to slow. The immediate crisis had passed, but they were far from safe. Caleb was injured, their horse was gone, and they were stranded in hostile territory. Night was falling, and with it, the temperature was dropping. "We can't stay here," Caleb said, his voice weak but firm. He tried to push himself up again, this time managing to get to his feet, though he swayed precariously. Ilara instinctively reached out to steady him, her small frame surprisingly supportive. "The horse?" she began, her voice filled with guilt. "It was my fault." Caleb shook his head, a grimace of pain crossing his face. "No. You did good, child." Bought us time. He looked down at her, a rare expression of something akin to gratitude in his eyes. "You were brave." Ilara felt a flush of warmth spread through her, despite the cold and the fear. His praise, so unexpected, so hard-won, meant more to her than she could say. They needed shelter, water, and Caleb needed proper medical attention, though where they would find any of those things in this desolate wilderness was a terrifying question. Caleb leaned heavily on his rifle, using it as a crutch. His good arm went around Ilara's shoulder, and together they began to stumble down the canyon, away from the site of the ambush, away from the dead man on the rim. Each step was an agony for Caleb, but he pushed on, driven by a primal need to protect the child beside him, a need that now seemed to burn brighter than his own pain. Ilara, for her part, bore his weight as best she could, her own exhaustion forgotten in the face of his suffering. She scanned the darkening landscape, her eyes searching for any sign of hope, a cave, a trickle of water, anything. The roles had shifted. He was still the protector, but she was no longer merely the protected. She was his ally, his caregiver, his small, fierce companion in this desperate struggle for survival. The confrontation had been brutal, the sacrifice real. But in its crucible, something new had been forged, the bond of shared hardship, of mutual reliance, a fragile partnership born of violence and necessity. The wilderness stretched before them, vast and unforgiving, but they faced it together, two wounded souls clinging to each other in the encroaching darkness. The night was a long torment of cold, pain, and gnawing fear. Caleb, feverish from his wound, drifted in and out of a troubled consciousness, his muttered words a jumble of past battles and forgotten names. Ilara, huddled beside him in a shallow overhang of rock that offered little protection from the biting wind, did her best to tend to him. She moistened his cracked lips with the last of their water, readjusted the crude bandage on his arm when it slipped, and spoke to him in soft, reassuring tones, though she doubted he could hear her. Her own hunger and exhaustion were a dull ache in the background of her anxiety for him. She had never felt so alone, so utterly responsible. The vast, indifferent silence of the prairie night pressed in on her, populated only by the distant howl of a coyote and the rasp of Caleb's labored breathing. When dawn finally broke, a pale, cheerless light filtering into their miserable shelter, Caleb was weaker, his skin hot and dry to the touch. His eyes, when he opened them, were clouded with fever. Ilara knew, with a chilling certainty, that if they didn't find help soon, he would die. Desperation lent her a grim resolve. She had to find water, first and foremost. She scanned the desolate landscape, her gaze lingering on a line of stunted willows in the distance. Willows often meant water. It was a long shot, a desperate hope, but it was all she had. "I'll be back," she whispered to Caleb, though he seemed barely aware of her presence. She touched his hot forehead, a gesture of helpless affection, then turned and began to walk towards the distant trees, her small legs leaden with fatigue. The journey was arduous. The ground was uneven, littered with sharp rocks and thorny bushes that tore at her thin dress and scratched her skin. The sun, climbing higher, beat down mercilessly. But the image of Caleb, pale and vulnerable, spurred her on. After what felt like an eternity, she reached the willows. And there, to her immense relief, was a tiny seep, a patch of damp earth where a trickle of muddy water pooled. It wasn't much, but it was water. She knelt, cupped her hands, and drank deeply, the cool liquid a balm to her parched throat. Then, using Caleb's discarded tin cup which she had salvaged, she carefully filled it, trying not to stir up too much mud. The journey back was even harder, the full cup requiring all her concentration. When she finally stumbled back into their shelter, Caleb was delirious, muttering incoherently, his eyes wide and unfocused. She knelt beside him, gently lifting his head, and pressed the cup to his lips. He drank greedily, some of the water spilling down his chin. She managed to get most of it into him, then soaked a strip of her dress in the remaining water and used it to bathe his hot face. Slowly, very slowly, the fever seemed to recede slightly. His breathing became a little easier, his eyes less wild. He looked at her, a glimmer of recognition in their depths. "Water," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You found water?" Ilara nodded, a wave of relief washing over her, so profound it left her weak. "There's more," she said. Not far for the next few days, Ilara became Caleb's lifeline. She made countless trips to the seep, bringing back water, her small body pushed to the limits of its endurance. She found a few edible berries, though they were scarce and bitter, and shared them with him. She talked to him, telling him about the wild flowers she saw, about the shapes of the clouds, anything to fill the silence, to keep his spirit tethered to the world of the living. He remained weak, his wound still angry and inflamed, but the fever subsided, and the light of awareness returned to his eyes. He watched her as she moved about their crude camp, her small form tireless, her determination a quiet force. He saw the scratches on her arms and legs, the weariness in her eyes, the way she rationed their meager supplies, always ensuring he had the larger share. He had tried to protect her, and in the end, she was the one who had kept him alive. The irony was not lost on him. One afternoon, as he lay propped against a rock, his arm throbbing dully, he spoke, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "We need to move." "Can't stay here." Ilara looked at him, concern etched on her face. "Are you strong enough?" He managed a grimace that might have been a smile. "Strong enough to be a burden, maybe. But we can't wait for them to find us again." Or for winter to set in. He knew they needed to find a settlement, a town, somewhere he could get proper medical attention, somewhere Ilara could be safe. The thought of facing civilization again, especially in his current state, was daunting. But the alternative, perishing in the wilderness, was not an option. Not for her. With Ilara's help, he managed to get to his feet. He was unsteady, his wound a constant agony, but his will was strong. He fashioned a crude crutch from a sturdy branch, and leaning heavily on it, and on Ilara, they began their slow, painful journey out of the desolate canyonlands. Their path was uncertain, their destination unknown. But they were together. The bond between them, forged in fear and tempered by hardship, had deepened into something profound, something unspoken yet unbreakable. He was no longer just her protector, and she was no longer just his charge. They were partners, bound by shared suffering and a fierce, mutual determination to survive. They walked towards the hazy outline of distant mountains, a new path unfolding before them, one that led away from the immediate violence of their past, towards a future that was still a terrifying blank, but one they would face, for now, side by side. The healing was slow, both for Caleb's body and for Ilara's spirit, but each painful step forward was a testament to their resilience. Their journey was a slow, arduous crawl across a landscape that seemed determined to break them. Caleb, leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch and Ilara's small but surprisingly strong shoulder, fought against the persistent pain in his arm and the weakness that clung to him like a shroud. Ilara, though bone-weary herself, was a stoic presence, her youthful resilience a quiet miracle. She foraged for what little sustenance the parched land offered, tough roots, a few sour berries, once even a clutch of bird eggs discovered in a thorny thicket. She found water in unlikely places, her senses sharpened by necessity. They spoke little, their energy conserved for the relentless effort of survival. Yet, in their shared silence, a deeper understanding grew. He saw her courage, her quiet tenacity, the way she faced each new hardship without complaint. She saw his indomitable will, the way he pushed himself beyond the limits of endurance, his concern for her safety overriding his own suffering. After many days, when Caleb felt he could go no further and despair was a cold knot in Ilara's stomach, they stumbled upon a sight that made them both pause, a thin ribbon of smoke curling into the vast blue sky. Smoke meant people. People meant potential help, but also potential danger. Caleb's hand instinctively went to the Colt still holstered at his hip, his expression wary. "Stay close," he murmured to Ilara. They approached cautiously, moving through a sparse stand of pines that offered some cover. Soon, they saw it, a small, isolated homestead, a rough-hewn log cabin with a sod roof, a patched corral holding a couple of bony horses, and a small, struggling vegetable patch. A woman, her back to them, was hanging laundry on a line strung between two poles. She was sturdy, her movements efficient, her dress faded but clean. Caleb hesitated. He was a wreck, gaunt, filthy, his arm bandaged crudely, a rifle in his good hand. He knew how they must look, like dangerous drifters. But Ilara's hopeful gaze, fixed on the cabin as if it were a palace, decided him. He took a deep breath and stepped out into the open, Ilara a step behind him. The woman turned at the sound of their approach, her hand flying to her apron pocket, where Caleb guessed a small pistol might be hidden. Her face was weathered, her eyes sharp and appraising. She wasn't young, but there was a strength in her posture, a resilience that matched the harshness of the land she inhabited. Caleb began, his voice raspy. He tried to keep his tone non-threatening, his hands open and away from his gun. "We mean no harm. My daughter and we're in need of help." "I'm injured." The woman's gaze flickered from Caleb's blood-stained bandage to Ilara's small, exhausted face. She saw the desperation in their eyes, the genuine hardship. Her expression softened slightly, though the wariness remained. "What kind of trouble you in, mister?" she asked, her voice direct, no nonsense. "Bushwhacked," Caleb said simply. "Lost our horse, supplies." He didn't offer more details. He didn't need to. In this land, such stories were common enough. The woman studied them for a long moment, her eyes lingering on Ilara. Perhaps she saw something of her own past struggles in their plight, or perhaps it was the simple human instinct to help those in dire need. "Name's Martha," she said finally, her voice losing some of its edge. "Martha Riley. This here is my place." She gestured towards the cabin. "You look like you could use some food and a safe place to rest. That arm needs tending to proper relief," so potent it was almost painful, washed over Caleb. He sagged slightly against his crutch. Ilara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Martha led them into the cabin. It was small, just one room, but it was clean and warm, a fire crackling in the stone hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. Compared to the desolate wilderness they had endured, it felt like paradise. Martha, it turned out, was a widow, her husband lost to a fever some years back. She worked the small homestead alone, her resilience a testament to the harsh realities of frontier life. She was tough, pragmatic, but beneath her gruff exterior lay a core of kindness. She clucked over Caleb's wound, her touch surprisingly gentle as she cleaned it with hot water and some kind of herbal poultice that stung but also soothed. She rebandaged it with clean strips of linen, her movements practiced. "You're lucky," she said, her brow furrowed. "Could have lost that arm." Or worse, while Martha tended to Caleb, she gave Ilara a bowl of warm stew and a piece of freshly baked bread. Ilara ate slowly, savoring each mouthful, the simple food tasting better than anything she had ever eaten. She watched Martha, her initial fear giving way to a hesitant curiosity. Martha, in turn, observed Ilara, her gaze shrewd but not unkind. She saw the shadows in the child's eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the hunger that went deeper than mere physical starvation. She asked no probing questions, understanding that some wounds were best left undisturbed. Over the next few days, under Martha Riley's capable care, Caleb began to heal. The fever finally broke completely, and the angry inflammation in his arm subsided. He was still weak, but the gnawing pain lessened, and he began to regain some of his strength. Ilara, too, began to mend. The regular meals, the warmth of the cabin, the relative safety of Martha's presence, all worked their slow magic. She started to help Martha with small chores, feeding the chickens, fetching water from the well, weeding the small garden. She rarely spoke, but her eyes began to lose some of their haunted look. She would watch Martha work, her hands busy, her presence a steady, reassuring anchor in a world that had been terrifyingly unstable. Martha, in her own quiet way, offered Ilara a different kind of protection than Caleb had, the protection of routine, of domesticity, of a woman's quiet strength. She didn't coddle the girl, but she treated her with a gruff affection, sometimes humming old tunes as she worked, the melodies filling the small cabin with a sense of peace Ilara had almost forgotten existed. Caleb, confined mostly to a cot in the corner, observed the interactions between Ilara and Martha. He saw the tentative trust blooming in Ilara, the way she slowly began to unfurl like a tightly closed bud. He felt a profound sense of gratitude towards Martha, a debt he knew he could never fully repay. He also felt a growing unease. This place, this fragile peace, couldn't last. He was a wanted man, not by the law, perhaps, but by men like Blackwood. His presence here endangered not only Ilara but Martha as well. He knew, with a heavy heart, that they would have to move on soon. But for now, in this small, isolated homestead, surrounded by the vast, indifferent wilderness, they had found a temporary sanctuary, a brief respite on their long, uncertain journey. It was a fragile haven, but it was enough to allow them to catch their breath, to heal, and to gather strength for whatever lay ahead. The days at Martha Riley's homestead settled into a rhythm of quiet healing and unspoken anxieties. Caleb's arm mended steadily, the raw wound knitting into a puckered scar, another testament to a life lived on the precipice. He began to take on light chores, his strength returning slowly, chopping firewood with his good arm, mending a broken fence rail, his movements still stiff but purposeful. He watched Ilara blossom in the small patch of stability Martha provided. The girl's silence, once a shield of terror, was gradually giving way to hesitant speech. She would ask Martha quiet questions about the names of plants in the garden, or the habits of the prairie dogs that chattered nearby. She even, on rare occasions, offered a fleeting smile, a small, precious gift that lit up her serious face. Martha, with her pragmatic kindness, treated Ilara not as a burden or a curiosity, but simply as a child who needed care. She taught her to knead dough for bread, the rhythmic motion a soothing balm. She showed her how to mend torn clothes, her own calloused fingers guiding Ilara's smaller ones. There were no grand pronouncements of affection, just a steady, unwavering presence, a sense of normalcy that Ilara drank in like parched earth drinks rain. The homestead itself, though isolated, was not entirely cut off from the world. Once a week, a grizzled trapper named Jedediah, an old friend of Martha's late husband, would stop by on his rounds, bringing news from the nearest settlement, a rough-and-tumble mining town called Purgatory Flats, a good 2 days' ride away. Jedediah was a man of few words, his face a roadmap of wrinkles etched by wind and sun, but his eyes were kind. He'd share a meal with them, his presence a brief, welcome intrusion of the outside world. During one such visit, Jedediah, while sipping Martha's strong coffee, glanced at Caleb, his gaze lingering on the healing scar on Caleb's arm and the peacemakers that were never far from his reach. Heard some talk in Purgatory, Jedediah said, his voice a low rumble. Man named Blackwood, from down Redemption Way, lost some property. Offering a reward. Description matches a girl, about her age. He nodded almost imperceptibly towards Ilara, who was outside, scattering feed for the chickens, blissfully unaware of the conversation. Caleb's blood ran cold. Martha's hand, holding her coffee cup, stilled. Description of the man with her? Caleb asked, his voice carefully neutral. Jedediah looked him straight in the eye. Tall. Quiet. Fast with his guns. Scar on his face. The silence in the small cabin was thick with unspoken tension. Martha set her cup down with a decisive click. Silas Blackwood is a vulture, she said, her voice laced with contempt. Always was. Praise on the weak. Jedediah nodded. Word is, he's hired some hard men. Not bounty hunters exactly, more like hired guns. Desperate types. He paused, then added, they're asking questions. Showing coin. Caleb looked out the small window at Ilara. The brief, fragile piece they had found felt suddenly paper-thin, easily torn. He had known this was coming. He had hoped for more time, but time was a luxury they didn't have. We'll leave in the morning, Caleb said, his voice flat. Martha looked at him, her expression a mixture of concern and understanding. You ain't fully healed, Caleb. And where will you go? North, Caleb said. Further into the territories. Less settled. Harder to track. He knew it would be a difficult journey, especially with winter approaching, but staying here was no longer an option. He wouldn't bring Blackwood's violence down on Martha. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin was subdued. Ilara sensed the shift, the return of a familiar tension, though she didn't know its cause. She watched Caleb check his guns with a renewed intensity, his jaw set in a grim line. Martha packed them a sack of provisions, dried meat, hardtack, a small bag of flour, some of her precious coffee. Her movements were efficient, her face unreadable, but Ilara saw the sadness in her eyes. Later, as Ilara lay on her small pallet, pretending to be asleep, she heard Martha and Caleb talking in low voices by the dying embers of the fire. She needs more than running, Caleb, Martha said, her voice soft but firm. She needs a home. A chance at a life. I know, Caleb replied, his voice weary. But I can't give her that. Not while men like Blackwood are hunting us. All I can offer is to keep her safe, for as long as I can. Safety ain't just about dodging bullets, Martha said. It's about belonging. Feeling like you have a place. Caleb was silent for a long moment. Maybe someday, he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. But not yet. The next morning, before dawn, Caleb and Ilara prepared to leave. Martha pressed a small, carved wooden bird into Ilara's hand. Something to remember us by, she said, her voice a little rough. Ilara clutched the bird, her eyes filling with tears. She looked from Martha's kind, weathered face to the small, sturdy cabin that had been her first real sanctuary. She didn't want to leave. But she knew they had to. Caleb awkwardly thanked Martha for her kindness, for everything. Words failed him, but the gratitude in his eyes was profound. Martha simply nodded, her gaze steady. You take care of that girl, Caleb. She's a special 1 inch. As Caleb and Ilara walked away from the homestead, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Ilara looked back. Martha stood in the doorway, a solitary figure, watching them go. Ilara raised her hand in a small, hesitant wave. Martha waved back. The homestead, their brief haven, receded into the vastness of the prairie. The hard-won quiet had been shattered, but something essential had shifted. Ilara was no longer just a frightened victim. She had known kindness, care, a glimpse of what a different life could be. Caleb was no longer just a solitary drifter. He had accepted help, shown vulnerability, and his fierce protectiveness over Ilara had solidified into something akin to paternal love. They were a found family, forged in hardship, their path uncertain, their future precarious, but their bond, now tested and affirmed, was their truest strength. The shadow of Blackwood loomed, but they faced it together, walking towards the unknown, carrying the memory of Martha's kindness like a small, warm flame in the desolate wilderness. The journey north was brutal. The landscape grew harsher, the air colder. Autumn was giving way to the first bitter taste of winter, and the wind carried the promise of snow. Caleb, though not fully recovered, pushed them relentlessly, his fear of Blackwood's pursuit a constant spur. Ilara, wrapped in a thicker shawl Martha had given her, trudged silently beside him, her small face set in a stoic mask that mirrored his own. The memory of Martha's homestead, its warmth and fleeting security, became a painful ache, a stark contrast to the bleak reality of their present. They were fugitives again, their existence pared down to the elemental necessities of survival: food, water, shelter from the encroaching cold. The carved wooden bird Martha had given Ilara became her most treasured possession, clutched tightly in her hand during the long, cold nights, a tangible link to a moment of peace. Caleb taught Ilara more about survival, how to set simple snares for rabbits, how to identify the driest tinder, how to read the signs of changing weather in the clouds and the behavior of animals. He was a demanding teacher, his instruction sparse and direct, but she was an eager student, understanding that these skills were not just lessons, but lifelines. Her resilience continued to amaze him. She rarely complained, her small body enduring hardships that would have broken many grown men. He saw in her a reflection of the unyielding spirit of the frontier itself, harsh and unforgiving, yet capable of breathtaking beauty and strength. One evening, as they huddled in a makeshift lean-to against a freezing wind, the first snowflakes beginning to fall, Caleb shared a rare piece of his own past. He was staring into the meager flames of their fire, his face shadowed and grim. "I had a family once," he said, his voice so low Ilara barely heard him. "A wife." "A son." Ilara looked at him, her eyes wide. He had never spoken of such things. "What happened to them?" she whispered. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Fever. Took them both." Same winter he picked up a stick and poked at the fire, the silence stretching between them, heavy with unspoken grief. "There was nothing I could do." Ilara reached out a small, hesitant hand and touched his arm. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed a depth of understanding that words could not. He looked at her, his eyes filled with an old, raw pain, and for a moment, the wall he kept around himself crumbled. He didn't pull away. After that night, the silence between them changed again. It was still their primary mode of communication, but it was now imbued with a shared understanding of loss, of the fragility of life. Ilara began to see the man behind the stoic gunslinger, the grieving husband and father. And Caleb, in turn, saw Ilara not just as a child he needed to protect, but as a kindred spirit, someone who understood, in her own young way, the deep wounds that life could inflict. Their progress slowed as the weather worsened. Snowfall became more frequent, blanketing the landscape in a pristine, unforgiving white. Finding food became a desperate struggle. The snares often came up empty. Caleb grew gaunter, his face etched with worry, but his determination to protect Ilara never wavered. He would go without, ensuring she had what little food they managed to find. One afternoon, they stumbled upon a deserted trapper's cabin, half hidden in a grove of snow-laden pines. It was dilapidated, the door hanging by one hinge, a hole in the roof, but it offered shelter from the relentless wind and snow. It felt like a gift from Providence. They spent several days there, repairing the worst of the damage, gathering firewood. For the first time in weeks, they were relatively warm, relatively safe. The enforced intimacy of the small cabin brought them closer. They would sit by the fire in the evenings, Caleb cleaning his guns, Ilara mending their tattered clothes with a needle and thread salvaged from Martha's supplies. Sometimes, Caleb would tell her stories, not of gunfights and violence, but of the stars, of the ways of animals, of the vast, wild beauty of the land, his voice low and resonant in the quiet of the cabin. Ilara, in turn, began to share fragments of her own life before Blackwood, memories of her mother's songs, of a small garden she used to tend, of a beloved rag doll lost long ago. These were precious, fragile things, shared in the hushed intimacy of their sanctuary. It was during this time, in the quiet solitude of the snowbound cabin, that Ilara truly began to heal. The nightmares still came, but they were less frequent, their edges softened by the reassuring presence of Caleb nearby. She started to hum old tunes, melodies her mother had taught her, her voice small and hesitant at first, then growing a little stronger, a little clearer. One day, while Caleb was out checking his snares, Ilara found a piece of charcoal from the fire and, on a smooth piece of birch bark, she began to draw. She drew the cabin, the snow-covered trees, a tiny, brave wildflower pushing through the snow. She drew Caleb, tall and stern, but with kind eyes. When Caleb returned, empty-handed but for a fresh layer of snow on his hat, he found her absorbed in her drawing. He looked over her shoulder, his expression unreadable. She looked up at him, a little shy, a little fearful of his reaction. He picked up the drawing of himself, studied it for a long moment. A rare, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. "It's good," he said, his voice gruff. "You have a gift, child," Ilara beamed, her face lighting up with a pure, unadulterated joy that Caleb hadn't seen before. It was a small moment, but it was profound. In the heart of the harsh winter, in a desolate, forgotten cabin, they had found a measure of peace, a fragile sense of belonging. The threat of Blackwood still hung over them, a distant shadow, but for now, they had carved out a small space of warmth and light in the vast, cold wilderness. They were no longer just surviving, they were, in their own quiet way, beginning to live. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the world outside, but within the walls of the small cabin, a found family, bound by hardship and affection, weathered the storm together. The respite in the abandoned trapper's cabin could not last. As the first thaws of a reluctant spring began to soften the edges of the snowdrifts, Caleb knew they had to move on. Their meager supplies were dwindling, and the isolation, while temporarily a shield, could become a trap. Blackwood's memory, he knew, would be long, and his greed relentless. The thought of Purgatory Flats, the mining town Jedediah had mentioned, resurfaced in Caleb's mind. It was a risk, a den of rough men and shifting loyalties, but it might also offer anonymity, a chance to earn some money, and perhaps, a way to get Ilara to a safer, more settled place, further east, away from the raw frontier where men like Blackwood thrived. He broached the idea to Ilara one evening, as they shared a thin rabbit stew. "We need to find a town, Ilara," he said, his voice gentle. "Somewhere I can find work. Somewhere, safer for you." As Ilara looked up from her bowl, her eyes, now clearer and more expressive, clouded with a familiar anxiety. "Will they find us there?" she asked, her voice small. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But we can't stay hidden forever. You deserve more than this." He gestured around the small, rough cabin. "You deserve a proper home. School, maybe. Friends your own age." Ilara was silent for a moment, stirring her stew with a wooden spoon. "My home is with you," she said finally, her gaze direct and unwavering. Caleb's heart constricted. Her simple declaration, filled with a child's fierce loyalty, was both a comfort and a heavy burden. He reached across the small, rickety table and briefly touched her hand. "I know, child. And I'll always look out for you. But this life, it's no life for a girl." Their journey to Purgatory Flats was slow, marked by a renewed sense of caution. Caleb avoided main trails, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Ilara, now more confident in her wilderness skills, walked beside him, no longer a frightened burden, but a capable companion. Purgatory Flats, when they finally reached it, was exactly as Jedediah had described, a sprawling, chaotic collection of tents, hastily erected shacks, and a few more permanent, if ramshackle, wooden buildings, all clinging to the sides of a muddy, ore-stained gulch. The air thrummed with the noise of picks and shovels, the rumble of ore carts, and the boisterous shouts of miners. Saloons and gambling dens seemed to outnumber all other establishments. It was a raw, untamed place, fueled by gold fever and desperation. Caleb found them a room, small and grimy, above a boisterous, 24-hour eatery that smelled perpetually of stale beer and fried food. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over their heads. He quickly found work, not as a gunslinger, though his reputation, unspoken but sensed, preceded him, but as a guard for one of the larger mining operations, protecting the payroll and the sluice boxes from opportunistic thieves. The work was dangerous, the hours long, but it paid enough to keep them fed and sheltered. Ilara, confined mostly to their small room, found the noise and chaos of Purgatory Flats overwhelming after the silence of the wilderness. She missed the clean air, the quiet companionship of Martha, the rugged beauty of the landscapes she had traversed with Caleb. But she understood why they were here. She spent her days reading from a tattered primer Caleb had bought her from a traveling peddler, practicing her letters on a slate, and mending their clothes. She would watch the teeming life of the street below from their small, dirty window, a silent observer of the human drama unfolding. Caleb, despite his exhaustion, always made time for her in the evenings. He would listen patiently as she read to him, her voice gaining confidence with each passing day. He would answer her questions about the strange characters they encountered, his responses brief but insightful. He was a constant, steady presence in her turbulent new world. One day, a woman who ran a small laundry service near their lodgings, a kind-faced widow named Mrs. O'Malley, noticed Ilara sitting alone by the window. She struck up a conversation, her Irish brogue warm and inviting. Soon, Ilara was spending a few hours each day helping Mrs. O'Malley, folding clean linen, her small hands surprisingly nimble. Mrs. O'Malley, who had lost her own daughter years ago, took a shine to the quiet, serious girl. She would share stories, teach Ilara simple songs, and sometimes slip her a sweet biscuit. For Ilara, Mrs. O'Malley's small, steamy laundry, filled with the scent of soap and clean cotton, became another small sanctuary, a respite from the roughness of Purgatory Flats. Caleb watched this tentative friendship with a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was good for Ilara to have contact with someone other than himself, to experience a woman's gentle kindness. But he also knew that forming attachments made them more vulnerable. He remained vigilant, his senses always on alert for any sign of Blackwood or his men. The name Purgatory Flats seemed apartment. It was a place of transition, a limbo between the raw wilderness and the settled lands further east. It was a place where fortunes were made and lost, where lives were cheap, and where redemption, if it existed at all, was hard-won. Caleb knew they couldn't stay here indefinitely. It was too dangerous, too volatile. But for now, it was a necessary stop on their journey. He saved every spare coin, his dream of getting Ilara to a safer place, a place where she could truly thrive, burning steadily within him. He had found a measure of purpose in protecting her, a quiet redemption for his own past losses. And Ilara, no longer the silent, terrified child of the Redemption Saloon, was slowly, painstakingly, building a new life, one small act of courage, one tentative connection at a time. The scars remained, both his and hers, but they were no longer just symbols of pain, they were also testament to their resilience, to their enduring capacity for hope, and to the unbreakable bond of their found family, a quiet, hard-won peace blooming in the most unlikely of soils. The future was still uncertain, the path ahead fraught with potential dangers, but they faced it with a quiet dignity, two souls who had found solace and strength in each other, against the harsh backdrop of a world that had tried, and failed, to break them.